Hello, and welcome to the American Philosophical Society's conference, week-long symposium and conference, Meanings of Independence. My name is Patrick Spiro, and I'm the librarian of the American Philosophical Society. And before we get the conversation started, I just wanted to take a few moments to both welcome everybody and talk a little bit about why we're holding the conference that we're holding this week. First off, this conference is meant to mark an exciting new collaboration between the David Library of the American Revolution and the American Philosophical Society. The David Library and the APS entered into an agreement 2 years ago to create a new center called the David Center for the American Revolution at the American Philosophical Society. This center is going to support research and scholarship and education on the era of the American Revolution in a number of ways. First off, it offers a number of fellowships for scholars that need to come and use APS and David Library resources. We're launching, and this is a part of the launch, a number of programs meant to advance knowledge about the American Revolution and to reach a wider audience, including school children, teachers, and the general public. And finally, we're trying to make available a vast array of library resources to, again, advance scholarship and knowledge on the American Revolution. And so I encourage you all to take a moment and check out the David Center for the American Revolution at the APS. It's on our website, and you can look at all the opportunities that this new center is going to be offering a whole range of people, from the general public to teachers to students to scholars. The second reason we wanted to host the conference this year is that we're 5 years from 2026, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And we thought it would be a great opportunity to convene scholars, public intellectuals, leaders of cultural institutions, and the engaged public in conversations about what 2026 should look like. What are some of the key themes and topics that institutions like the APS and museums and public intellectuals and school teachers, what are the things that we should be talking about both today and in the lead up to and during 2026? And so I'm excited to welcome everybody to start the conversation today. It's a week-long conversation every afternoon, Monday through Wednesday at 1 o'clock. We're going to be hosting a panel. And then on Thursday and Friday, we're going to be hosting a hybrid conference in which people can come to these sessions here at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia or tune in from afar via our online platforms. So I look forward to seeing everybody either online or in person this week, and I'm excited to get this conversation started. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Kyle Roberts.
Thanks, Pat. Well, good afternoon. I'm Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Associate Director of Library and Museum Programming at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to the first day of the APS Hybrid Conference, Meanings of Independence. I'm glad that so many of you have been able to join us today. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. The Society expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of the Lenape, as well as that of numerous other Indigenous communities and individuals throughout the continent who have offered guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration that make the work of the Society's library and museum possible. For those of you joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who've made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1.5 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please check our website, amphilsoc.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. And we'll put a link into the chat so you can follow up on that. As part of the programming for the David Center for the American Revolution, as Pat has just explained, this week's conference on Meanings of Independence brings together public intellectuals, scholars, educators, leaders of cultural organizations and government agencies, and all manner of other engaged citizens who have an interest in the revolution and its commemoration in 2026. Virtual panels will be held Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Zoom. I hope you'll come back tomorrow and join us again. These panels will be followed on Thursday, October 21st, by a project showcase for the APS's newest digital project, The Revolutionary City, a portal to the nation's founding. And then on Thursday evening, an opening keynote conversation featuring Scott Stevenson, Anthea Hardig, and Christy Coleman. The conference will continue on Friday, October 22nd, with a full day of discussion and reflection on the meanings of independence. A full schedule is available on the conference website, and all sessions will be live streamed and accessible via the APS website and the Facebook page. Now, as you've probably seen, we're using Zoom webinar today. So not to worry, you have all been muted. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom center of your navigation bar. You might want to just locate that right now. Ask your question at any time during our presentation today. We've left ample time at the end of the panel for questions with our speakers. We're also very happy to offer closed captioning for today's virtual discussion. If you'd like to use it during the panel, please click on the CC box, again on the bottom navigation bar of Zoom. It's to the right of the Q&A button. And with that, I am so pleased to introduce Katherine Grandjean, who will be moderating today's panel on sexuality and identity in the American Revolution. Dr. Grandjean is Associate Professor of History at Wellesley College. Her research explores the North American encounter between colonial and indigenous peoples, as well as histories of warfare, violence, and the environment. Her work has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, American Antiquarian Society, the APS, and many others. She is the author of American Passage, The Communications Frontier in Early New England, published by Harvard in 2015, as well as numerous articles in the William & Mary Quarterly, the American Quarterly, and Early American Studies. She is currently working on a new book about the legacies of the American Revolution in the Southern backcountry through the stories of a series of murders in Kentucky and Tennessee in the 1790s. And I can't think of a better person to be our moderator today. Thanks so much for doing it, Katherine.
Okay, thanks, Kyle. So I'm going to introduce everyone. I'm going to introduce all the panelists at once in the order that they're going to present, and then we'll be off to the races. And this is a fairly sort of active and prolific set of panelists, so bear with me. Lorri Glover is the John Francis Bannon Endowed Chair in the History Department at St. Louis University. She is the author of All Our Relations, Blood Ties and Emotional Bonds Among the Early South Carolina Gentry, Southern Sons, Becoming Men in the New Nation, The Shipwreck That Saved Jamestown with Daniel Blake Smith, Founders as Fathers, The Private Lives and Politics of the American Revolutionaries, and The Fate of the Revolution, Virginians Debate the Constitution. She's also co-edited several volumes with Craig Thompson Friend, most recently Reinterpreting Southern Histories, which came out in 2020. She also has a textbook reader called Discovering the American Past. And her latest book is Eliza Lucas Pinkney, An Independent Woman in the Age of Revolution, which came out in 2020. Glover has served as president of the Southern Association for Women Historians, a distinguished lecturer with the OAH, and on the executive council of the Southern Historical Association. Amy Pflugrad-Jackisch is associate professor of history at University of Toledo. Her first book, Brothers of a Vow, Secret Fraternal Organizations and the Transformation of White Male Culture in Antebellum, Virginia, was published in 2010. She is currently finishing a book manuscript entitled The World of Westover, Mary Willing Byrd, Gender, Slavery, and the Economics of Citizenship in Revolutionary Virginia. A portion of this project also appears in Women and the American Revolution, edited by Barbara Oberg in 2019. And she has a chapter coming out in the soon-to-be published volume, The Cambridge History of the Age of Atlantic Revolutions, Volume 1, edited by Wim Klooster, expected to be published in 2022. Mary Sarah Bilder is the Founders Professor of Law at Boston College Law School. Her latest book, Female Genius, George Washington and Eliza Harriet in the Dawn of the Constitution, will be published in early 2022. Her previous books include The Transatlantic Constitution, Colonial Legal Culture and the Empire, Appeals to the Privy Council from the American Colonies, an annotated digital catalog, and Madison's Hand, Revising the Constitutional Convention, which was awarded the 2016 Bancroft Prize in American History and Diplomacy and was named a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. She has taught at Boston College since 1994 and has also been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School and Columbia Law School. Her recent scholarship has focused on the history of the Constitution, transatlantic feminism, James Madison and the founders, the history of judicial review, and colonial and founding era constitutionalism, as well as Robert Morris, the early African-American civil rights activist and lawyer. And finally, John McCurdy is author of Quarters, The Accommodation of the British Army and the Coming of the American Revolution, which was named 2019 Book of the Year by the Journal of the American Revolution. He is also the author of Citizen Bachelors, Manhood and the Creation of the United States. His work has been published in the Cambridge World History of Violence, the Journal of Urban History, and the New York Times. He's currently at work on his third book, tentatively titled The Parson Was a Bougre, Homosexuality and the American Revolution, which investigates a series of trials involving a British lieutenant accused of sodomy on the eve of American independence. He's taught at Eastern Michigan University since 2005. Okay, and with that, I think I will turn it over to Lorri.
Okay, Katherine, you'll let me know if you can't hear me, right? You'll give me some kind of note in the chat.
I can hear you, Lorri.
Good, good. I just always want to make sure, as Katherine said, in the fall of 2020, around this time last year, I published a biography of Eliza Lucas Pinckney. The subtitle of the book was An Independent Woman in the Age of Revolution. And one of the main things I was interested in that book was sorting out what it meant to be an independent woman in the 18th century, how women defined independence in the 18th century. So the paper that I shared for the conference is derived from the research I did on the Pinckney biography, but I shifted the point of view. So when I wrote in the biography about the American Revolutionary era, I depicted it mostly from the point of view of Eliza Lucas Pinckney. That is, I tried to see it through her eyes. And when I wrote about the people in her family, I wrote about her perceptions of their experiences, her grief about them, her advice to them. But in this paper, I've shifted to multiple perspectives, different people in her family and an enslaved woman. And that may have produced a hodgepodge of stories. I hope it didn't. But even if it did, I hope that it also reflects on some of the larger ideas that I adopted, some of the ideas that I developed in the course of researching and writing about Eliza Pinckney. And I hope it contributes to our ongoing conversation about the diversity of perceptions of the American Revolution, the war for independence, the meaning of independence, and the interplay of all of those things. So the 5 stories that I tell about wartime experiences of Eliza Lucas Pinckney, her daughter, Harriet Pinckney Lorri, 2 of her daughters-in-law, and a woman the Pinckneys enslaved, all point to, first of all, I think the necessity of regional specificity in our considerations of gender and independence. So the Pinkney women share several things in common with Mary Willing Byrd, who Dr. Pflugrad-Jackisch will talk about in just a moment. Byrd, like the Pinkney women, was elite. All of them were focused on family success, and they were deeply fearful of family ruin in the Revolutionary era. They endured the sort of chaos of occupation. And maybe most importantly was the pervasiveness of slavery and racialized power to their experiences during the Revolution, and beyond that to their sense of identity and to all of their values. Having said that, South Carolina is different from Virginia in lots of ways. And certainly the experiences of elite women in the late 18th century South would be very different from the experiences of, laboring women in New York or Philadelphia, enslaved women in the countryside of North America, and so on and so forth. So I really think we have to think a lot about region when we think about gender and independence. And class intersects with that as well. So it was surprising to me to find out the complicated intersections of class and gender in the war zone. I wish I had had John McCurdy's paper in advance because he has some really fascinating things to say about class, gender, rank as well during the period. So Charles Cotesworth Pinckney and Thomas Pinckney, Harriet's brothers and Eliza's sons, were both taken prisoners of war after the fall of Charleston. Their experiences in captivity, though, were wildly different from the experiences of ordinary soldiers who were taken POW. Eventually, the two brothers became part of a prisoner swap. They sailed to Philadelphia. They took their wives and their children with them. Once they got to Philadelphia, a friend of theirs loaned them a house out in the countryside. Another South Carolina family joined them. It turned out to be not too bad a way to wait out the end of the war when they still were technically prisoners of war. That was very different from the experiences of Eliza Pinckney and Harriet Pinckney Lorri, who stayed in South Carolina and endured a horrible wartime experience of fear, deprivation, loss, violence. And whereas the men in the family were shielded from the worst parts of being a prisoner of war because of their class, I think it's possible that the elite rank of the women in the family made them bigger targets of the occupying forces. I think we also have to be more mindful in our studies of stage of life. And here I think historians of the Revolutionary era could learn from the interesting work done by Civil War historians, especially historians of women during the Civil War, who have thought in really nuanced and important ways about the intersection of stage of life with the ordeal of war. And so I was very struck in my own research about the differences, not of experience so much as perception and reaction, between Eliza Lucas Pinckney, who was past the middle part of life when the revolution came to South Carolina, and her youngest daughter-in-law, Betsy Mott, who was still a teenager. The gendered analysis of independence was, though, I hope, my most important contribution in the biography and to the paper that I shared. The break with England and the Revolutionary War did not secure Eliza Pinckney's independence. In fact, it demolished it. She has spent the prior 2 decades building up her definition of independence for herself, for her children, for the sort of the future of the Pinckney family. It's quite similar, I think, to Mary Willing Byrd's conception of independence and the work that she did to pursue her independence. If we shift from Patriot leaders' political definition of independence to independence with more capacious meanings, it can include women like Harriet Pinckney Lorri and Eliza Lucas Pinckney and Sally Middleton Pinckney. And I think it's a really important corrective to historians who still, are deeply influenced by John Adams' old assertion that the revolution was not a part of the war, that the revolution was in men's hearts and minds, and the war was no small part of that. So my research showed that 8 years is a long time to be in a war, and it was no small matter for women. And expanding our perceptions, I think, also opens up a deeper understanding of the suffering and the loss and the fear of the war, at the same time that it produces more diverse images of resolve and sacrifice and heroism in the struggle of independence. I closed with what I could uncover about Dinah, a woman who was enslaved by the Pinckney family and who used the chaos of the war to seek her own freedom and pursue her own life of independence from bondage with her 3 children. And I know that she had a definition of independence for herself and a hopeful future for her 3 children, just as Eliza Pinckney had a definition of her independence and what that would mean for her 3 children. Thinking about women like Dinah requires us to ask whose war of independence and whose definition of independence. And it's not just gendered, but it's racialized as well. To connect to our session's larger theme of sexuality, I just point out the challenge of uncovering the sexual violence that was rife in the 18th century South, but that got expanded to also include white women and got politicized during the war years. John, of course, did a fantastic job of uncovering a similarly hidden kind of history in his paper. I was unsure what to make of the story that Harriet Pinckney Lorri remembered her whole life about soldiers chasing Mary Mott into her grandmother's bedroom in the middle of the night. And I wondered, and I wonder still, about Dinah and how she happened to be alone with 3 children, one still in the womb, if she was fleeing from men who had preyed upon her, or if in flight she ran into men who violated her. So looking toward 2026, I guess I just say I hope it turns out to not be a simple rehashing of myopic, celebratory public perceptions of our country's history, that blurring of nostalgia and history of the sort of slide from, I guess, commemoration into celebration distorts the lives of very powerful men like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, and it erases the lives of women like Eliza Lucas Pinckney and like Dinah. And so I hope that we will all be building toward a 2026 that includes their stories and their meanings of independence, and not just a celebration. I think that's my time, so I'll stop there.
Good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this conference. I'm very glad to be here with you. My paper today is part of a larger book project entitled The World of Westover, as Kate mentioned earlier. My paper's focus today, the presentation that I want to give you today, is about the experience of enslaved people at Westover during the war and Mary Willing Byrd's reaction to their efforts to secure their freedom. In particular, I'm interested in examining the experiences of 2 enslaved men from Westover named Watt Harris and Jack White. Harris and White traveled as bodymen with Mary Byrd's late husband, William Byrd III, as he led Virginia regiments for the British Army during the French and Indian War. As a result of Harris and White traveling further than most enslaved people in Virginia, they actually were able to go to the backcountry of Carolina. They went to New York City, Western Pennsylvania, Canada, and to Philadelphia, where William Byrd met Mary Willing in the 1760s. As a part of this experience, they gained lots of valuable insights into travel, into the British Army, that I think paid off, particularly for Watt Harris later during the American Revolution, and made them kind of unique, I think. After the French and Indian War, Harris and White returned to Westover with the Byrds. They found wives there at the plantation for themselves, and then they also settled down and had families while working for the Byrds in the mansion. They worked very closely with Mary Willing Byrd as men who worked in the house, and they interacted with both of Harris and White's families very closely as well. In addition, the Byrds, Whites, and Harrises collectively experienced William Byrd's humiliating financial decline and eventual insolvency. And they were witnesses to the large and devastating slave auction at Westover after William Byrd's death in 1777. The Byrd, Harris, and White families then had a long and intertwined history before the British came to Virginia and Westover as part of the Revolution. In January of 1781, Benedict Arnold, on his first mission for the British Army, landed at Byrd's Riverside Plantation and disembarked nearly 800 troops. The soldiers stayed for about a week. For Byrd and the enslaved people who lived there, a decision had to be made: stay or go, cooperate or resist. For Byrd, who had 8 children and numerous reasons to protect her property, she remained on the plantation. I don't know if I'd say she cooperated, but she didn't really have many other options. She decided to stay. Harris, though, Watt Harris left with Arnold and served as a guide for the British Army throughout the rest of the war. 49 other slaves ran away from Westover during the war, and that was only almost half of Byrd's enslaved laborers on the plantation. Jack White, on the other hand, who had also traveled with Harris and William Byrd during the French and Indian War, he and his family chose to stay. Watt Harris became a guide for Benedict Arnold and then Lieutenant John Simcoe, and later for Lord Cornwallis himself. As a Black riverboat pilot and guide, he had extensive knowledge of the waterways and local road systems in Virginia. Plus, he had traveled with the British Army and gained them valuable insights. Harris's work for the British involved him going up and down the river and visiting plantations to talk with enslaved people and gather intelligence about the movement of Continental troops, which he did very successfully. At one point, as part of his mission, he also returned to Westover while Continental troops were stationed at the plantation. His job was to, quote, bring off Jack White to help the British. But unfortunately, while he was there, he was discovered by some of the Continental troops. He actually got in a skirmish with them, and he had to quickly leave the plantation without White and kill the Continental soldier. The question remains, did White want to leave? Did he want to continue to stay at Westover? It's unclear, but surely he wouldn't have come to bring him off, I don't think, as well as he knew him, without some indication that Jack too wanted to leave. This raises interesting questions about enslaved people's political and personal loyalties, about what we think we know about the role of enslaved people who stayed on the plantation during the war. For Mary Willing Byrd, the chaos of the war kicked off a fierce contest between her and the enslaved people who ran away from Westover. She aggressively pursued their recovery for long after the war. For Byrd's part, as a widowed plantation manager who believed her enslaved labor was pivotal to her family's economic independence and survival, she worked desperately and fiercely to recover her property. Byrd worked every angle that a well-educated elite white woman could, including her personal connection to Patriot leaders. She applied for a flag of truce that allowed her to communicate with British military officials and asked them to search their camps for enslaved property. Despite these efforts, her enslaved people found out that she was looking for them, and they hid themselves so well that they could not be found, despite a thorough 7-day search by British officials. Byrd wrote to Virginia Governor Thomas Jefferson and his successor, Governor Thomas Nelson. She wrote to Baron von Steuben and the Marquis de Lafayette in order to recover her lost property, but without success. In her letter, she employed Republican rhetoric of the day regarding property. To Jefferson, she wrote, quote, "What am I but an American? My whole property is here. Could I wish ill to everything I have interest in?" To Nelson, she wrote explicitly about the recovery of her enslaved property. Quote, "I have paid my taxes and have not been personally or virtually represented. My property is taken from me and I have no redress." Yet when Byrd spoke of her, quote, "property," it is important to note that she meant both land and slaves. Byrd repeatedly used Republican language to claim that her status as a tax-paying slaveholder entitled her to use certain rights and state protections of her human property. For Republican slaveholders like Byrd and others, political rights, economic independence, and authority all derived from property in land and in slaves. She believed that the war was fought for American liberties, directly linked to securing the right to property in enslaved people. So the war's upheaval and circumstances created a contest between Byrd and her former slaves for independence. After the British surrendered, Lord Cornwallis smuggled Watt Harris out of Yorktown and brought him to New York, where he gave Harris a certificate that verified his great loyalty and service to the British cause. Harris was only one of 2 Blacks who received compensation from the British government for their service as loyalists during the war. Back at Westover, Mary Willing Byrd was apoplectic. She knew that the British planned to evacuate from North America and feared that her human property would be lost forever. She wrote to American and British military officers about the recovery of her enslaved property, but again without success. She then turned to a personal connection, loyalist merchant Neil Jameson in New York. She wrote to Jameson saying that she knew at least 7 of her former slaves were there in New York, including Watt Harris. She asked Jameson if he could go talk to Harris and tell him that she would pay him to bring back her former slaves to Westover. She noted Harris's wife and child missed him and that she did not expect her former slaves to come back willingly. And can you imagine the audacity of this? Instead of helping Byrd, however, Harris fled to England, stating that he feared for his safety. Eventually, Harris returned to New York, where he died in the early 1790s. Byrd never recovered any of the 49 enslaved people who freed themselves during the war. And what I'm hoping to convey in this paper is that I think these are important stories to tell. My research sheds light on women slaveholders who used Republican rhetoric to argue that it was the responsibility of the state to protect and return their enslaved property. And I know that Lorri and I have talked a lot about this and about the role of women in the Revolutionary era being a lot more actively engaged in the political rhetoric and language. And I think there's other scholarship that bears this out as well, much more so than women in the antebellum period. And this is something we have to be careful to differentiate between. For the history of enslaved people in the Revolution, that they pursued their freedom is perhaps not surprising at this point. However, Watt Harris's story sheds new light on enslaved people's political allegiance and on people like Jack White. Harris talked to many different enslaved people who lived on plantations of well-known patriot leaders. And these enslaved people actively supported the British by providing information about patriot troop locations. We cannot make assumptions about enslaved people like Jack White, who chose to stay at their plantation during the war, but actively supported the British there. Harris's experience suggests that they not only wanted to leave, but worked on behalf of the British cause. Thank you.
Try this again. Thank you so much for including me in this conference, and it's a real pleasure to be able to speak here today. I'm on the other side of the project as from Lorri, which is I finished a book kind of in the loneliness of COVID, and it's just a pleasure to be able to share the introduction from that book, Female Genius, Eliza, Harriet, and George Washington at the Dawn of the Constitution. It's a particular treat to get to speak at the APS because the book's largely built on around newspaper advertisements written by Eliza Harriet. But there are 5 extant letters of hers. 4 of those are to George Washington, and those are at the Library of Congress. But the 5th letter is owned by the APS, a letter to Sarah Franklin Bache, Benjamin Franklin's daughter, a letter written in the summer of 1787, which discusses Bache's support for Eliza Harriet's lectures and her possible patronage to form a female belles letters academy in Philadelphia. Now, the center of my book situates itself in the summer of 1787, the moment associated with the drafting of the Constitution. But the foundation of the book lies earlier in the 1770s and 1780s, the period of this conference. And I was struck in scrolling through the attendees list how many of you are in the bibliographic essay that accompanies this book, because this is a book really built on an enormous foundation of other people's wonderful scholarship. I look to this period, which I call the age of the Constitution, to investigate the rise of a radical new idea in the English-speaking world, the idea of female genius. And the exemplar of that phenomenon in this book is Eliza Harriet Behrens O'Connor. She was the daughter of Benjamin Barron's, famous of writs of assistance fame, and the niece to the governors of New York and New Jersey. She was born in Lisbon and traveled with her father to the United States. And back in London in 1776, she married an Irish Catholic lawyer turned would-be magazine founder. And they travel eventually after the war to the United States. Her life is the story of a transatlantic reform politics that interpreted contemporary struggles as step towards more perfect political representation, and promoting ideas made more famous later by Mary Wollstonecraft and Catherine Macaulay. Eliza Harriet embodies the idea of female genius in the United States. Its advocates argued that women had equal capacity and they deserved an equal education and political representation. And they saw in female teachers, in particular, an important type of economic independence. She delivered at the University of Pennsylvania in the summer of 1787 a Bell Letters lecture attended by George Washington and other Constitutional Convention delegates. And because of his presence, her lecture was widely publicized across the United States. Her lecture was cited as the example that American women would desert the toilette and the parlor for the college and the forum. And as the first such public female lecturer, I believe her performance likely inspired the gender-neutral language of the Constitution. But the detractors of female genius, who feared it would undermine white male political power, felt deeply threatened. And by 1792, Eliza Harriet experienced the struggles that reflected the larger backlash, to use Rosie Zagari's term, faced by women and people of color, as this new genre of the written Constitution became a political and legal tool to create exclusions based on sex, gender, and race. So female genius tries to make clear that America's framing moments, widely interpreted, did not belong solely to white men, and to offer up also a transatlantic history of people who saw education as a foundational political right. So in the limited time remaining, let me just stress 4 points that I think are particularly pertinent to this conference. First, instead of thinking about this period as one of revolution followed by constitution, or as revolution in contrast to constitution, I argue it was an age of the Constitution widely understood. And I emphasize this in a transatlantic sense, that it was characterized by a desire for greater representation, beginning in the 1760s and stretching outward. And this shift allows me to think about this period without the abrupt bifurcation caused by the revolution in 1776. In particular, it allows me to think expansively about how people reimagined their relationship to the constitutional state and the ways in which that could expand representation. So a second related point is that I do not believe that the 1787 Constitution suddenly shifted American political systems to an entirely new genre. Constitution here continued to be understood as a system of government in addition to a new instrument. And so only slowly were aspects of this new genre of the written Constitution being worked out. In particular, the power of a written constitution to embed white male political power was only gradually becoming realized. And the categories that written constitutions would use to manipulate that power were being created. This was, as the subtitle calls it, the dawn of the Constitution. And in this period, it was not yet obvious that not being a white male was going to place one outside of political power. And so in this space, we can see this transatlantic movement to reverse the classic inferiority argument, the belief that women were inferior to men and therefore were justifiably excluded from constitutional politics. We see in this period the citation of living female examples, Phyllis Wheatley is one, to justify female genius. And we can connect this to female debating societies of the 1770s and 1780s, the rise of the novel as a female author genre, the rise of belles letters and public speaking by women, the rise of female education, and the example of New Jersey Jersey's wide suffrage. And I try and tease out here this argument that establishing female capacity through education and oratory was linked directly to a claim for constitutional participation. Thus, in this space, we can reposition Benjamin Rush's famous thoughts upon female education as what I argue a conservative argument. Rush isn't even a generic conservative argument. Once we know that Eliza Harriet was there in Philadelphia, we can reinterpret his remarks as personally determined to destroy her plans. She argued that summer, not just for the power of female speaking, but for a female belles lettres academy, governed by a half-female board with a female in charge, run by majority rule. It was an academy that, if it had been able to obtain a state charter, would have become a college. And every comment in Rush's thought was aimed personally at Eliza Harriet, at her commitment to French, at her commitment to public speaking, at her Irish immigrant citizenship, Irish immigrant status, at her lack of children, at her economic self-sufficiency, at her belief in the power of female education and female teachers. Read against the presence of Eliza Harriet and female genius, Rush's anxiety is about female independence, that female-led education would show that women with equal capacity could participate in the constitutional state as opposed to being good wives for American citizens. Let me end with one final point. Independence in my book comes in many forms, but what is remarkable is in this period from the 1770s through to the 1790s, constitutional systems appeared possibly theoretically open to thinking about constitutional participation in a broader, more capacious way. And what is striking by the 1800s is that the rise of the new genre of the written constitution was seized on by white male power to inscribe sex, gender, and race-based exclusions. Only slowly in future generations would those tools be turned again to once again imagine expanding independence. Thank you very much.
Hello, it's my honor and privilege to speak with you today, and thank you for taking the time to hear about some of my research. I want to thank my fellow panelists. These are all great papers, and I've really enjoyed reading them and hearing more about them. I also want to thank Patrick, Kyle, Magdalena, and of course, Adriana for organizing this conference. So this looks to be a great week. In my time today, I want to talk about my larger research project and how the paper that's before you fits into it. In the summer of 2011, I was researching at the William L. Clements Library at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and I came across an 18-page transcript of a military trial that had something to do with Bougre and this chaplain in the British Army's 18th Regiment. As this was not germane to my project, I set it aside. 5 years later, I returned to the project and sought to see if I could make something out of this. As I discovered what I had found at the Clements was only the tip of the iceberg. Future trips to the UK National Archives at Kew, I discovered additional transcripts and several other additional cases taking place among the officers and enlisted men of the 18th Regiment. Nearly all of these had something to do with either sex or disrespect for authority. Moreover, the chaplain who had been accused of Bougre was at the center of all of these cases. Toward that end, I've been trying to sort this out. I've been trying to figure out the different cases, the individuals involved. My interest here is I believe this gives us a way of looking at homosexuality in the era of the American Revolution. As I note in my paper, not much is written about LGBTQ people at the era of the Revolution, in part because ideas of sexuality aren't solid then as the way they are now, but also because we don't have good sources. I think about the probably the most typical case we think of a sodomy trial during the Revolution involves Continental Army Lieutenant Enslin, who's a court-martialed for attempted sodomy in 1778. What we know of this man comes from 2 paragraphs in the writings of George Washington. By contrast, I've discovered hundreds of pages relating to Robert Newburgh, and which include discussions of male-male sexual acts, people's reaction to them, and how we might fit these into the context of the Revolution. Of course, the person at the center of all of this is Robert Newburgh, chaplain to the 18th Regiment of Foot, also known as the Royal Irish Regiment. Newburgh was a Protestant Irishman from a middling family who had a degree from Trinity College and was ordained a priest in the Church of Ireland. Shortly before his 30th birthday, Newburgh was commissioned a lieutenant, and in the summer of 1773, he joined the 18th Regiment, then in Philadelphia. Even before he had arrived in America, rumors were swirling that he had had sex with his male servant. Toward that end, Newburgh initiates a series of legal actions. In December of 1773, he files a civil suit in Philadelphia against his primary accuser, Thomas Batt, who I discuss in the paper. When this fails to settle matters, Newburgh turns to military justice. His commanding officer convened a court of inquiry in April of 1774, which I mostly discuss in the paper. This likewise proved inconclusive, and so ultimately Newburgh received a 3-week-long general court-martial in New York City in August of 1774, where a lot of these issues converge. In none of these cases was Robert Newburgh accused of having had sex with a man. The incident, if it occurred at all, took place before Newburgh had joined the army and an ocean away. Instead, the cases mostly revolve around whether or not Newburgh's reputation had been impugned by those gossiping about his sexuality and whether or not Newburgh's subsequent actions disqualified him from military service. This, of course, means that my project is no bodice ripper or codpiece ripper, but I do believe it gives us a way of thinking about views of male-male intimacy in the era of the American Revolution. Robert Newburgh's not central to all, he's central to all the cases, but not all the cases are about him. He hovers over many of them like a specter. There are cases involving people who are accused of having said the parson is a bugger and trying to get to the end of that. Newburgh also becomes involved in other cases that don't necessarily involve him. Probably most prominently is a case involving Private Nicholas Gaffney. Gaffney was an enlisted man in the 18th Regiment who accused his commanding officer, his captain, of corruption. Although these corruption charges were proved false, Gaffney, for his troubles, was sentenced to receive 1,000 lashes on his bare back. A number of civilians in Philadelphia found this abhorrent, and so they contacted Newburgh as chaplain to say, can you do something to help this poor man out? Newburgh tries to help the man out. He's ultimately unsuccessful, but of course, this further denigrates Newburgh's reputation in the eyes of the captains and in the regiment as a whole. These cases and more all intertwined with one another at Newburgh's general court-martial in August of 1774, in which ideas of homosexuality merged with questions of disobedience. As a result, I believe Newburgh's trials allow us to see in dramatic relief how sodomy was understood in the 18th century. The military context further sharpens these matters. Had Newburgh remained a civilian, the rumors probably would have just been rumors, and had he not demanded military justice, the British Army probably would have ignored the entire affair. But the coordination of these events become determinative. The captains had heard about Newburgh's actions before they met him, and the chaplain's disrespect for military authority confirmed these rumors. Indeed, Newburgh's sexuality and disobedience were particularly meaningful in the era of the American Revolution. On the eve of war, British officers stationed in cities like Philadelphia were vigilant against any challenge to the standing order, fearing that disrespect for military authority revealed fissures in the empire, if not the divinely appointed structure of society. Newburgh's greatest enemies were British officers who were deeply loyal to king and country, while his greatest defenders were men who eventually fled the British Army and became US citizens. In effect, opinions of Newburgh foretold divisions between loyal Britons and patriotic Americans. For this reason, I believe Newburgh's cases allow me the unique opportunity to situate homosexuality in the context of the American Revolution. Historians, including some of whom we've heard of today, have discussed the liberating influence independence had on race, class, and gender. Might the same be true of sexual orientation? My research suggests that fears of buggery was largely an English obsession that was not replicated in the colonies or the nation that followed. Instead, there were greater opportunities for male-male intimacy in America than in the mother country, at least in the 19th century. Newburgh's trials can help us see this in greater relief. Now, originally I intended this to be a short article, and it's gotten away from that a bit. It's grown into a book-length manuscript. I finished a second draft of it last summer, also being trapped by COVID. But I started sharing this with some historian friends of mine, and one said what he found very interesting about this was the material I have on character, and he wanted me to think more about that. And that's why I've highlighted this section in the paper before you. In addition to character, I look at several other lenses for understanding Newburgh and the accusations of homosexuality in this era. I do think about 18th century Anglo-Atlantic ideas about homosexuality, gender identity and performance, religion, military life, seduction, scandal, and the effects of the Enlightenment. For all of these, I found a very rich historiography, but I found nothing on these ideas of character. And so that's what I wanted to raise this in this conference. I'm curious if character as an idea provides a useful lens for thinking about sexual orientation and sexuality in this era. I think it occurs too often to be merely coincidental. I also think it's something different than honor. Honor seems to be more of a collective quality, whereas character is more individual. If character is a useful framework, what might be the consequences? Beyond helping us understand homosexuality in this era, might it help us understand other things as well? Certainly, character is a gendered and racialized term, and I think it'd be important to think about that also in the context of sexual orientation. In closing, I just want to thank you for having listened to me and reading my paper, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thanks everybody. I don't want to take too much time away from the Q&A because I know we have some good questions, but I thought I would kick us off with kind of a big picture question. And I know Lorri just gave us a sort of very eloquent plea for more regional specificity and sort of nuance in the way we talk about some of these stories. But I wanted to sort of pull back to a wider lens and ask the panelists to say a little bit about how working on these projects has changed your view of the American Revolution and or how revolutionary it may or may not have actually been. And that's a question I've been thinking a lot about recently myself, but the reason why I'm asking is that as I read the papers, I thought that sort of collectively, they did allow for a kind of more expansive view of the revolution and the period, different ways of thinking, different ways of being, different language around same-sex sexuality. I mean, I do think that that idea of character as being a sort of inflection point in the way they speak about it is really interesting. And, you know, Lorri, you actually call the Southern phase of the revolution in some ways a women's war, which I think is sort of fascinating. We see an enslaved man being compensated by the British government. And then, of course, in Mary's paper, you know, we get a much more sort of capacious and inclusive and expansive view of Constitution. But I still felt a sort of, at the end of reading, there was something that sort of, you know, I still felt, well, there's something kind of constrictive and conservative about the way a lot of these stories end up. It's, you know, after all, it's not Eliza Harriet's vision that sort of wins the day in the end. So I just wanted to ask all of you to think out loud a little bit about that. Are we seeing a different revolution? And to what extent do you see it as a change agent with regard to gender and identity and sexuality?
I'll go first. I actually think that the revolution, not just from my own research, but from just teaching about it as well, during the time of the war was actually had great potential for radicalness. And that there were radical things that were unraveled and put back together in really unique and exciting ways. And I'd be actually interested to hear what Mary has to say about this. To me, it seems as though it was the ratification of the Constitution that kind of brought that all to a screeching halt, or, you know, that it was a later time that ended that. But during the war itself, you know, in 1781 in Virginia, I feel like anything could have happened, but it was very radical, and that circumstances were important in that.
So maybe I can jump in there, connected to what Amy said. I think my thinking changed. First of all, let me back up and say, I think when I started, I was so nervous about my technology, I didn't say thank you to everyone for, you know, sharing papers, organizing the conference, including me. So better late than never, I suppose. I have to say, when when I taught the American Revolution before I read about Eliza Lucas Pinckney, I mostly taught it, to Mary's point, separating revolution from constitutionalism. I taught it principally in a neo-Whig framework. I didn't think very much about the Revolutionary War at all. I think I had 2 or 3 sessions in a whole semester on the Revolution. And I can recall telling class after class of students, aside from the battlefields, the Revolutionary War was a remarkably bloodless affair. I think I must have read that somewhere sometime. And it turns out, like, I just misled a whole bunch of young people, because that's not true at all. And so I read in the literature about, loyalist, about the sort of chaos and the brutality of the war. And certainly that was what Eliza Lucas Pinckney and the other women in her circle emphasized, was the war, the peril, the danger, and to Amy's point, the radicalism. So that's the way my thinking has changed the most.
Yeah, I'll just echo what other people are saying. I mean, for me, I like Lorri, I do the big survey and I have like the revolution, the Constitution. But I think as I have spent a lot more time thinking about this, there's reasons when that's a useful bifurcated construct, but increasingly I feel a very useful stance here is to appreciate the breadth of the transatlantic reform constitutional argument that is part of Ireland in this period, that is within England in the Society for Constitutional Information, that is in all different places in the United States, that is part of the movement to think about what I consider to be early civil rights and the abolition of the slave trade as part of that. And so for me, trying to move beyond that sort of teleological bifurcation is a way to think about a lot of these moves as ways to imagine oneself better represented in a constitutional system. And I think one of the ways that helps, certainly for me, is that it stops us from thinking the sort of like, did people win or lose? Or only hearing the majority vote. And it really creates a lot of space to hear voices that were pushing for different understandings of their own representation, even if at the end of the day, you can show by 1807, those possibilities are closing down. So I was thinking about the nice way Lorri ended about sort of like, what would you hope for in 5 years? I would really hope for some ways in which we think about revolution and constitution as structurally at the same moment, instead of this sort of like, now we have to wait 10 more years to do that. And for me, one of that things has been really pushing back at this notion that there's suddenly a written constitution and the whole country overnight moves into a different mode, and instead thinking of constitutionalism throughout this whole period as a structure about who gets represented, who can claim power, and how and why. And so newspaper research is a huge chunk of my book because we just see so many different arguments and voices there.
If I could finally just add a few thoughts. I love all my fellow panelists' comments, and I agree with a lot of them. I think I remain very positive about the American Revolution as an event and as an idea. And I think, to build on some of the previous speakers' points, I used to think, and I think I'm used to thinking of the revolution as a moment of possibility. And I think that's especially true if we think of women and African Americans, that there is this moment of 1776, which is lost later. But through my own research, I think it looks a little different. I think if we look at men in particular, we don't see this angle. And I think the category of white men is a bit too broad to encompass some of those details. In my work on bachelors, I found that unmarried men gain a lot of rights during the revolution and after the revolution that aren't lost. And I think I'm seeing some of in my research on Newberg, I think there's some things with male homosexuals or sexual minorities broadly construed that don't go away the way that women's rights and African-American rights do in this era. And I think, just finally to touch also on Mary's point, I think the Enlightenment can't be lost in all of this, because there are these ideas that are coursing through Ireland, England, America, certainly, and that those ideas rise above revolution. They intersect with it, certainly, but they're a really important intellectual basis to consider.
Okay, great. Thank you all. I have a couple of questions for Amy, I think especially about gender and the experience of enslaved people. How did gender shape enslaved people's freedom seeking? I'm thinking of the different dangers and opportunities faced by Dinah versus the Black men from the Westover estate. That's from Sean Gallagher. And then there's another question. What does Professor Pflugrad-Jackisch make of Watt Harris's decision to leave his family behind? Were there any examples of enslaved family flight among the 49 who left in 1780?
So 49 enslaved people ran away during this time. And I know there was a woman named Fanny Harris who may or may not have been related to Watt Harris, who runs with her child and makes it into the Book of Negroes and is settled in Canada later. So there are examples of women and women with children from the estate who do run. Unfortunately, to my great distress, all of the records that listed who ran away were destroyed. And so I know there were 49 slaves who ran away. That's what Mary Byrd tells us, but I don't have the list of them. And so I have been able to put together various pieces here and there that allow me to tell their story. But unfortunately, I don't have a full list of who ran away, which is been something I've been chasing after for a long time, hoping I can find somewhere. I do think that because of Watt Harris and Jack White's unique status as traveling with William Byrd during the French and Indian War, that gave me the opportunity to talk in more detail about what that would have been like. But I do know, again, there's Fanny Harris and her child, and there were other people from the estate who fled, and whole families who fled, from what I can tell, that did not stop them. I can imagine, like Dinah, that they had different challenges to face, though. And that perhaps I wouldn't count them out, though, for political allegiance, because I've been doing some research on this. And I did find that for the British Army, there were women who worked in making munitions and making gunpowder and doing different things for the British Army that were part of the group that followed Cornwallis and others from not just Virginia, but from South Carolina and North Carolina and Georgia that came up from the South as they moved into Virginia. And so I do think that that both men and women were expressing political allegiance and loyalty to the British Army, and also took their opportunity to run for their own freedom as well. I hope that answers all of the questions. Oh, why did Watt leave his family? I don't know. He was able to stay in contact with them because when he died in the 1790s, the family knew that from different letters that they received. I don't know exactly how, but somehow he stayed connected to them. And that's what I know about that.
Thanks, Amy. I'm looking through the Q&A, and I think since we're kicking off the conference called The Meanings of Independence, this might be a good question to sort of put out there. Lorri, you talked about sort of the importance of analyzing independence and concepts of independence through the lens of gender. And Judith Van Buskirk asks, could you sort of hum a few more bars on what the Pinkney women's notion of independence was? I understand their lives are different from their husbands, but how does that translate into notions of independence? Yeah, let me ask you that first.
Sure. So Eliza Lucas Pinckney was widowed when she was, I think, 31 or 32 years old. She never remarried again. She and her husband had moved from the colonies to England. They came back on a visit to South Carolina. He got sick and died. And in the time that they had been in England, their estates had fallen into disrepair. Maybe I should back up and say they owned 9 large plantations spread across the Low Country. They owned 3 houses in Charleston, as well as lots of rental property. And they were just huge. They were a huge plantation family. So Eliza became the executor of the will. She was the guardian of the 3 minor children, and she was the principal beneficiary of the will. Her authority was so complete that she did not bother to even go to court to verify the will. Like that, they waited another decade to do that. And so she spends between 1758 and about 1774 raising children, rebuilding a massive estate wholly dependent on slave labor, trafficking in human beings, commercially marketing crops around the Atlantic world. And her goal was to become financially independent, to create a lasting legacy for her children and for the Pinkney family across generations. And so that was her definition of independence: financial security, familial renown, influence. And so when I said the revolution didn't bring it, it demolished it. She was expelled from her homes, her property was seized, her principal country residence was burned, so on and so forth. So she thought about independence primarily in financial and familial terms.
Amy, would you say that that's true of Mary Byrd as well? I mean, one thing that I thought was so interesting in your paper that came through quite strikingly is that her notions of independence and her sort of quest for independence and her ability to have independence is quite contingent on the sort of dependence and subjugation of her enslaved people, right? It's almost sort of like the two are mutually exclusive and cannot sort of exist in the same arena. And so I don't know if you want to sort of jump in on that question as well, the gendered idea of independence.
I completely agree that she did see her independence in economic terms, because she didn't meet the qualifications for being a freeholder because she was female. And so the idea of having political independence, I think, was a different concept for her. She had to think in economic terms. And like Lorri just mentioned about Eliza Lucas Pinckney, her independence was completely tied to maintaining enslaved labor in order to keep her family. And one of the things that I did want to mention is that, so one of the things that she held up is the lead as a hallmark, as a gain of the American Revolution, is the abolition of primogeniture and entail. And I think for women and for enslaved people, that this was not a gain, because entail kept enslaved people tied to different properties. And so when there was an auction, like when the male plantation owner died, then they couldn't be broken up and the families would stay together. And this was true also of the trust that was created for Mary Willing Byrd in her estate with Westover. But for other women who lost that ability for entail and even having a separate estate or a trust, like I think with Eliza Lucas Pinckney, because she was independent, if there had been a debt collection, they would have been able to take away the enslaved people, breaking up the enslaved people's families, but also destroying that economic independence. And so I think from a gendered perspective and from the perspective of enslaved people, that abolition of entail and primogeniture looks very different.
I have a couple of questions here for John. From Kate Hallman, I appreciate the idea and approach of a third way between acts and identity. To what extent was the interpretation of Newberg's same-sex desire as a characterological failing of manhood/masculinity possible and important because he was unmarried and so couldn't access other signal performances of masculinity?
Yes, certainly. I think that's true with a lot of it. I mean, at the same time, of course, there are many other men in this particular regiment who are also unmarried, who then what do they go to for their to signal masculinity, to signal ideas of manhood and or more specifically character. And of course we're in sort of the era before we get sort of violent or hypersexual displays of masculinity that would be seen as appropriate for officers in the British Army. So it's a bit of a tricky navigation, I think, for people like Newberg at this time.
I wanted to ask you, John, I was glad that you raised the sort of presence of enlightenment as a backdrop for this story. I wondered whether you see whether you see ideas and attitudes around same-sex or male-male sexuality as in flux in this period, and whether that is related at all to sort of Enlightenment thought about human nature. Or, I mean, we're sort of in a period in the late 18th century where original sin and innate depravity are kind of falling away as ways of understanding aberrant behavior, and people are beginning to embrace the idea that most people are sort of inherently good. And I don't know, I was curious whether you saw that as sort of an important context in a way for the story that you're telling.
Yeah, I borrow some of these ideas from Charles Upchurch, who mostly works on homosexuality in Britain in the 19th century. But he raised this idea, which I'm intrigued by. I don't know if I completely buy, that the Enlightenment we have to understand as creating the possibility for same-sex intimacies to be allowed, even if it doesn't come to full fruition. And I think in that way, the way we probably would think about race or sex in that same context. But further to that point, I mean, it's interesting. So, of course, Robert Newberg in his trial will never say, I am a homosexual, right? He wouldn't have the term, but he never admits to having had sex with a servant or another man. He denies, or more typical, he obfuscates. He doesn't want to talk about the question. But in his own defense of himself, he will use terms such as equal rights. And he will cite phrases from classical literature to talk about, there's an expectation of equality. What a man does in private doesn't matter. And I think it's in very rudimentary forms, but he's beginning to use a language which I think later becomes key to the homosexual citizen, has been understood by future scholars, that what you're doing in your bedroom doesn't actually matter to whether you get to vote or be politically participate in politics or serve in the army. That there's some ideas rudimentary going on in some of Newberg's ideas. Of course, at the same time, understanding that he's not going to say, I am a proud gay man in this moment.
On the subject of sort of language and terminology, just to sort of follow up a little bit on this, there's a question here from Molly Nebbiolo. Can we use who loves your piece, by the way, can we use LGBTQ in an 18th century context? Or how could we term it, or what sort of different language can we use to make it more accepting than the harsh phrases or terms that were used to describe this sexuality by people of the period? I don't know whether you have thoughts about that, John.
Yeah. Just very quickly, I mean, I think I draw a lot of this from David Halprin, saying, we want to think of sort of homosexuality as being an umbrella term, maybe even in that sense, LGBTQ is a broader term. And I think it's comparable to, even though in the sources we have Negro, we would never write an entire book about African Americans in which we, only use that term. We would use African American or Black. And so I think to a certain extent, we want to modernize terminology to make connections, at the same time acknowledging that, of course, the terminology is different at the time.
Okay, let's turn a little bit to methodology and sort of source material. Nina Dayton asks, it would be great to hear Amy's thoughts and those of others on the panel on how one compares women's political writing and expressiveness in the 1770s and 80s to the antebellum decades. Methodologically, that strikes me as difficult. Should we limit it to one genre, like unpublished letters? After all, print culture explodes in these years, as does the number of published women authors and the incidence of women being willing to have their names used rather than pseudonyms. Do you think, Gary, that after 1820, many women were exercising self-censorship due to backlash and other factors?
I do think that. I do agree with what Rosemary Zagari says. And actually, Lorri and I have talked about this, about comparing the Revolutionary era women with antebellum women. And when both of us started our projects, we talked about how some of the things we found were kind of surprising to us, because we found that even we were writing back onto these women this idea of what a ladyhood or womanhood should be that was from the antebellum era. And the more research that we did about Eliza Lucas Pinkney and about Mary Lily Byrd, we found that these women were very different, and especially as Southern women, and that they were, I don't want to speak for Lorri, but I find that Mary Willing Byrd, and I don't think it's just her, something that's unique to her personality, is much more at ease with her political opinions, and she's forcefully expressing them, partially because she's pushy. But I think there are lots of other women from this era who don't see a conflict between their womanhood and expressing themselves politically in a way that is true, I think, in the antebellum period, where it's something where they kind of have to shrink down and be very careful about what they say, or they will. If you look at Kirsten Wood's book about female slaveholders, that they're relying on this concept of ladyhood to kind of protect them. But I don't think that's true of women in the era of the Revolution.
I think we're getting a little bit short on time. So let me just sort of ask you all to kind of take stock in a way. There are a couple questions about, the fact that, which is so striking, you're all writing in some ways about individuals, and which in a way I think is a great, there's sort of disadvantages and advantages to that, but it's a great way of bringing these stories from the revolutionary and constitutional eras to a broader public. So I wonder if the panelists have thoughts about, how do we begin to bring some of these insights into the wider conversation for 2026? How do we go about sort of translating what we do to something a popular audience can really embrace?
I hate long silences, so I'll just jump in, even though I'm not sure I have anything to say. I actually think we're in a really good moment to meet 2026 with, sort of fresh scholarship, a diversity of perspectives. I think one of the benefits of the Trump era, I thought we were post-Trump, maybe we're back pre-Trump, I'm not sure. But in the Trump era, I saw so many scholars committed to, sort of sharing their expertise to the broader public. I think so, sort of simultaneously, graduate programs are training historians to work within and beyond the academy. So public history is increasingly, a key element of what we're doing, and teacher training is important for what we're doing. And so, I'm hopeful that that the public understanding of 2026 will be infused with scholarly expertise of the kind that, Mary and John and Amy are doing. Because I think politically and also in terms of academic training, we're at a really positive moment.
Can I just add to that? I think one of the things that really is interesting is how much more accessibility public institutions and places like the APS have in putting up images in their websites, newspapers, private letters, all sorts of things that really allow you to tell stories that aren't based on sort of traditional published sources. And I think one of the things that really allows us to do is think about these sources from almost like a material culture point of view. How do we read those? And I know in my book, I spend a lot of time trying to explain how one can read her advertisements in ways that understands the ways in which language about women has become denigrated over time, and how can we recover those spaces. And I know, because I spend a lot of time on digital websites and things from repositories, how many repositories are really working on not just putting up images, but putting up sort of explanatory interpretation around images. And I think, things like National History Day, all of those are places where students go first to the web, to big institutions and small institutions to get that information. So I think they're just a crucial translator from maybe more academic history to the public.
Can I just jump in with one more thing? I know we're over time, but I just wanted to mention that I think that we have to also think about different ways that we are influencing people's ideas about the American Revolution. I have this wonderful student who's doing an honors thesis on how Hamilton has changed people's ideas, and what she's doing is she's looking at Twitter and how people have posted on Twitter, and how like the general public, or people her age anyway, taking information about the American Revolution are influenced by things like Hamilton and other things that they find on Twitter. And I think that's so interesting to think about, and that we need to be more creative, I think, about how the public receives their information about the revolution outside of conferences like this.
John, did you want to add anything? I don't want to cut you off by showing up on the screen. No? Okay. Well, this was a fantastic way to open our conference this week. And the questions that you are all wrestling with are the ones we're going to keep wrestling with all the way through Friday at 5 p.m. So many, many thanks to our presenters and to our great moderator. Virtual round of applause. Please join us again tomorrow at 1 p.m. for Slavery, Race, and Revolution. The conference will continue then. Thanks so much, everyone.